Anyway, thanks so much for coming out. This is the forum series on prayer is kind of stumbling over the finish line. So I was out of town last week. That's why we didn't have forum. Then the bishop is coming next week. And then after that is Thanksgiving. We'll be in Detroit with my son and his wife. And then there are 2 more sessions in December, and then that's it for prayer. You're on your own. If you haven't gotten it down by now, it's not going to happen. But anyway, so we'll be doing the Guyon this morning. One of the most interesting people, actually, you can read, I think. And then next month we'll do prayers of the African American community, starting with slave prayers, which is very, very moving. That'll be the first, whatever that middle Sunday is, like the 11th or whatever it is, 10th. And then the final Sunday, which is before Christmas, we'll be doing Thomas Merton on prayer, because Merton has been one of those monastics who kind of crossed over into all sorts of different domains. So that's what's coming up. Then I'm off January, off most of February. At the end of February, we start a series on the Eucharist, because we were talking, David and Shana and I were talking, and it's like, what kinds of topics could we have? And I said, well, how about the Eucharist? You know, we walk in every Sunday. There's the Eucharist, what's going on there? What's the sort of history of it, et cetera? And then after that series, we'll do the Trinity. There's another one. We have this Trinitarian confession. What does it mean? Trinity Sunday, I mean, it's really interesting. We say it's really important, but when Trinity Sunday comes around, all the clergy run.
No,
right? They don't know how to preach on it. Okay, no, I know. It's very interesting. So we'll look at the Trinity, and then the final one will be grace. Because we say things like, there, but the grace of God go I. And what does that mean? What does grace mean? We'll find out it means a whole lot of different things in the tradition. So those are the 3 themes for 2024. Yes?
I'm going to do an overview of the Gospel of Mark on the last Sunday of November.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. That's great. So an overview of the Gospel of Mark at the last one in November, right? For Thanksgiving Sunday.
When we start reading Year B.
Right, it goes into Year B. No, thank you. That's wonderful. And that was really fun when Shana suggested that, well, fun. Texts of Terror, fun. I don't know what's fun, but it was a nice sort of interlude to have sort of the scriptural section in October. So we're back to prayer now. And the woman we're looking at now, there's a professor of mine at the University of Chicago who's written probably the gold standard, at least in English, on the history of mysticism. His name is Bernard McGinn. And I read an interview with him recently in, I think, Commonweal, and they were talking about the volumes. It's a multi-volume work. It's really excellent, too, if you're interested in mysticism. And it said, you end the history of mysticism in 1717. What happened in the next centuries? And he said, well, the condemnation of the Guyon brings the Catholic tradition of mysticism to an end. And so he thinks that what happened with her had very serious consequences for the transmission of mysticism through the tradition. So he's both a really interesting exemplar of mysticism and also a tragic figure in the condemnation of her followers and of herself, and making her recant her position had very dramatic consequences for the mystical tradition in the Catholic Church. So she's a very interesting person that way. So her full name, the woman we're looking at today, is Jean-Marie Bouvier de la Motte Guyon, right? Everyone quickly. And so not surprisingly, she goes by Madame Guyon in the traditional discussions of her. And her birthday was 1648, which is the Peace of Westphalia. So the 30 Years' War comes to an end right when she's born. And she died in 1717. She was a laywoman. She was interested at certain points when she was young in becoming a nun, but then she didn't, she sort of went away from that. And at the age of 14 or 15, the dating is kind of sketchy on the different sources. She married Jacques Guyon, who was a very well-to-do person, sort of on the noble side of life, but had a very unhappy marriage with him. He was 20 years older than she was. And she had 5 children. And in the year 1676, 2 of her children died of smallpox, and her husband Jacques died. So it was a very major transition in her life. And again, note she's a lay person married with children, like others in the tradition. And she begins to turn to this Barnabite friar. Barnabites are clerics of the clerics regular of St. Paul. It's an order that started in the 1500s. And this guy, Francois Lacombe, starts guiding her, becoming her spiritual director. And I can understand why she would do that, because she had sort of inclinations toward mysticism in her own experience, but didn't quite understand what was going on. And then after her husband and children, two of her children died, she went through this very profound period of spiritual aridity that she thought, was hard to get through. But in 1680, so 4 years after her husband and two of her children died, she writes in her autobiography that God revealed God's presence in the center of her soul, and that she didn't just cling to God, but that God dwelt in her, right? So it's a difference between being united to God as something outside of you and dwelling, if you will, in God. And so she had this overwhelming experience. And she claimed, this probably didn't help her cause down the line, she claimed that she was an apostle, that God had made her an apostle. And as you know, in the church, apostolic authority is only given to bishops in terms of the Roman Catholic hierarchy. So the Pope and the bishops are apostolic, not lay people who have mystical experiences. But she was an apostle, not of the gospel, like Paul would say, but she was an apostle of mystical experience. And she actually uses this word in French. And I was reading an article yesterday about this, that she introduces the word experience into French discussions of religiosity. It wasn't a term that was really common before this time. And it becomes increasingly popular, this phrase experience, in Protestant pietism down the line. So God reveals God's presence to her in 1680. She then leaves her three surviving children, and I'm unable to find out what happened with them. But she leaves her three surviving children and travels around Europe with Lacombe, her director, and she goes to Geneva and then Turin and then Grenoble between 1681 and 1686. And during that time, she publishes in 1685 a short and very easy method of prayer. And that's what causes all this trouble. It's like a hand grenade goes off in the playground, right, in terms of the controversy. And so it's a very little text. It's like 50-some pages long. So it is short. Right? She wasn't inaccurate about that. And there are several reasons why it was a center of controversy. First of all, this is the era of Descartes. Right, so we're in the 1600s. René Descartes had just written his philosophy, and the Roman Catholic Church was very devoted to scholasticism to begin with. And then Descartes, good, I just had to check to make sure no one's left in the waiting room. Descartes' understanding of the human being focuses very much on the intellect, as you know. I think, therefore I am. And it's more like an immediate inference. I think I am. I think, therefore I am. And there's that great joke about Descartes on the airplane, and the hostess comes up to him and said, the flight attendant comes up and says, "Would you like some coffee?" And he said, "I don't think so," and he disappeared. Anyway, so that's Descartes. So there's a very strong focus in France, especially during this time, in the Catholic Church in particular, on reason, and you can see why, because this is also the era of Spinoza and of Galileo, and so reason was seen as very, kind of threatening to the church, and so the battleground really was seen as doctrine and rational defense of doctrine. So there are two reasons that she seems to get in trouble, at least actually three. The first is she had a very democratic idea of spirituality, that when she wrote this treatise on prayer, it was for everyone. She's teaching everyone, every Christian can and should be a mystic. Right? Actually, Karl Rahner said that in the later part of his life in the 20th century. Karl Rahner is a Jesuit theologian, and he said either every Christian becomes a mystic or Christianity goes away. Right? So anyway, there are people who think this way. So one is that she had this very democratic idea of mysticism, and her method of prayer would teach everyone how to experience the presence of God in this very intimate way. The second was, because of the focus on the mind, her focus is on the heart, right? So that was very threatening as well and seen as misdirected. And then finally, we'll see this, that for her, silence and quietude and stillness are absolutely essential. And the church of that day was much more activist, right? You have to be active, you have to cooperate with grace. You can't just quiet your will. And so the heresy was called Quietism. And it actually starts in Spain with this fellow named Molinos, and his thought comes into France. She never knew of Molinos, so they kept saying, you're a quietist like Molinos. And she goes, I don't know what you're talking about, basically, but it didn't matter. It didn't help her out that much. So after she publishes this treatise in 1687, she and Lacombe go to Paris, where she's imprisoned at the order of the king, by the way. And she was jailed and then freed after she offered to submit. So she offers to submit her writing to various bishops for their judgment. And when they came back with their opinion, she submitted to that as well. So she was not tenacious, recalcitrant, obstreperous heretic, quote unquote. She actually always saw herself as a daughter of the church. That's all she ever wanted to be. And so she said, if there are any errors here, I recanted them. But then in 1695, she was imprisoned again and goes through various prisons in the French system, if you will, for several years, and is finally released, I believe it was in 1703. And she spends the rest of her life, which would be 14 years, at her son's house in the city of Blois in France. And so that her son did survive after she left her family. And she silences herself. Right, so she submitted her writing to the authority. She rejected the things that they condemned, and then she refused to write anymore publicly. So she never published another thing. Her written works are multiple volumes, so she never stopped writing. And she, like Teresa of Avila, she wrote oftentimes in a state of ecstatic contemplation, sort of auto writing. But her writings were not published by herself. So she was very obedient to the church. What's interesting is her writings, and her main supporter in France is a fellow named Fénelon. And you may have heard of him. He's very influential. Kierkegaard reads Fénelon in the 19th century. He became an archbishop, so she had major support. And he was then condemned to heresy as well and winds up in prison at a certain point for his defense of her. But he was a major influential writer in France. But her writings, by and large, in France, Patsy was telling me earlier that she told somebody, a friend, that she was reading Madame Guyon, and she said, no, you should read her. Right? So even now, there's this cloud around her that makes her very, very suspicious. The interesting thing, though, is Protestants get interested in her right out of the gate, right? And it gets really close to home. In 1704, an edition of her work on prayer is published in Holland, right, which is a Protestant country. In 1742, her treatise on prayer is published in Philadelphia, right? In 1804, it's translated into English by a Quaker and published in Philadelphia. The Quakers loved her thought on prayer. In 1828, a German edition of her work on prayer is published in Lancaster, right? And in 1834, a German edition of her work on prayer is published in York. That was very east side of the river, right? But isn't that interesting? It was Philadelphia, Lancaster, York. So she was very influential in Germany, in Switzerland, in England, and especially here. There are people in the late 19th century, Methodists, citing her. Right, Charles Finney, a great revivalist preacher of the early 19th century, studied her. Right, so she actually comes into her own in Protestant countries, and especially in the United States. Very, very interesting. And it's precisely her democratizing move that was very appealing to people during that era, that kind of Jacksonian populist period in America in the 19th century. So her influence now is incredibly huge, but not so much in the Roman Catholic Church. It's kind of interesting. I read an article in the New Advent Encyclopedia, which is a Roman Catholic publication, and they said, and her influence grows throughout the centuries, unfortunately, among Protestants. Anyway, and so it's very interesting. But she, as I said, she did not see herself as kind of crypto-Protestant at all. She saw herself as a devout daughter of the church and lived that way. What's also interesting about her, and so I really recommend the whole work. It's not very long to read. It's available even online. What's interesting about her, and I can see why it got her in trouble, is she's very critical of the clergy. Because she says in this work, the clergy are the ones who should be teaching us how to pray like this, and they're not doing their job, right? So she says, the decay of internal piety is unquestionably the source of the various errors that have arisen in the church, all which would speedily be sapped and overthrown should inward religion be reestablished, right? So she's convinced that the decay of the church of her day was caused by the neglect of inward piety. She says, compose catechisms particularly to teach prayer, not by reasoning nor by method, that's kind of the Cartesian scholastic way, for the simple are incapable thereof, so notice she's interested in the uneducated, but teach the prayer of the heart, not of the understanding, the prayer of God's Spirit, not of human invention, right? So you can see the focus there. And then she says about it is incumbent on the clergy to instruct their parishioners in prayer. She says they should be taught to begin by an act of profound adoration and abasement before God, and closing the temporal eyes, endeavor to open those of the soul. They should then collect themselves inwardly, and we'll see that move a lot, and by a lively faith in God as dwelling within them. So when you have faith in God, you have faith in God who's living in you, right? That's where your faith is directed. Pierce into the divine presence. So by faith, you pierce into the divine presence in yourself, not suffering the senses to wander abroad, but withholding them as much as may be in due subjection, right? So all people should be taught to pray this way, especially the simple. Because actually they're closer to this than smart people. Because smart people want to think through everything through. Right? And if it's a prayer of the heart, it's a piercing into the divine presence within you, and anyone can do that, she thinks. Well, you can see these themes then in the reading that I chose, the selections I chose for today. The very opening quote there on page 1. You can see how deeply involved this prayer is for her with the heart. She says, prayer is an application of the heart to God and the internal exercise of love. And she then goes on to say, all therefore may and all ought to practice prayer. All who are desirous of prayer may easily pray, enabled by those ordinary graces and gifts of the Holy Spirit, which are common to all people. So she's not claiming some exceptional gift of charism or mystical experience or anything like that. She's not Teresa of Avila. This is a common gift of the Spirit. And I love this line. Prayer is the effusion of the heart in the presence of God. That's actually from another section of the writing, but I just threw it in there because it's such a pretty thought. So you can see it's very much in the heart, because for her, the mind goes from one topic to another, right? And it's constantly thinking of only one thing. If you think you're multitasking, you're just kidding yourself. There's no such thing as multitasking. There's moving very quickly from one thing to another, but we always need to attend with the mind to whatever we're doing, right? Or we walk into glass doors and do crazy things like that. So, but the heart can always remain in a loving relationship with God in the inmost part of the soul, right? And so you can pray constantly if you pray with the heart. You can't pray constantly if you pray with the mind. So she wants us to shift our attention from the mind to the heart. And I do think that was one of the things that got her in trouble, which is really interesting, right? That they would be so suspicious of that. So she says, the one great means to become perfect is to walk in the presence of God. And of course, this focus on perfection, Methodists love that, right? Christian perfection. It is by prayer alone that we are brought into this presence and maintained in it without interruption. So, and then she goes on in the next quote, the third quote, to talk about this, how you have this uninterrupted communion with God in the heart of your soul. You must learn a species of prayer which may be exercised at all times and by all sorts of people. And she actually lists them, but I didn't include it just for the sake of space. But it's, farmers, shopkeepers, everyone. It cannot therefore be the prayer of the head, but of the heart. Not a prayer of the understanding alone, which is so limited in its operations that it can have but one object at one time, but the prayer of the heart is not interrupted by the exercises of reason. Indeed, nothing can interrupt this prayer but irregular and disordered affections. So if your loves are in the wrong place, then that interrupts your prayer. But when we once have tasted of God and the sweetness of his love, we shall find it impossible to relish anything but God's self. Right? So the whole point is to taste God's sweetness. And once you taste God's sweetness, you will love God automatically. You just won't be able to help yourself. So that's the overall vision of prayer that she has. We'll see it gets even deeper than that, but that's the structure. So it's not reason, it's the heart, it's not what you understand. So it's certainly not verbal prayer. It's this inward affection of the heart. She goes on to say that there are basically two ways of introducing the soul into prayer. And so she's writing the catechism she thinks the clergy should have written, right? One is meditation, and one is reading accompanied with meditation. And so she seems to think you need something to read in order to focus the mind. And she's actually stumbled her way into meditative practice, because this is in fact what meditative practice throughout the world does. You first of all, you have to stop the mind jumping all over the place. So you have to still the mind. She said, it doesn't really matter what you're reading, just concentrate on it. And then when you get to a sense where you have something to relish and taste and digest in it, stop reading, right? And dwell in that. So she advises to read about half a page at the most. And she doesn't say this, but she wrote a lot of poetry. And poetry actually works better for this than a lot of other things. That's why the Psalms are so important in prayer, because they're poetry, right? And so one way to start prayer, and this is probably the way that anyone should start if they're not familiar with it, is to read in a meditative way. Lectio Divina, as we practice it now, that would be a very similar move. You just dwell in this text and let it sink into you. But her favorite method is meditation straight up. And that's in the third quote from the bottom. Meditation, which is the other method, is to be practiced at an appropriate season and not in the time of reading. So you're not to be reading something when you meditate. I believe the best manner of meditation or meditating is as follows. And this is really interesting. When by an act of lively faith, you are placed in the presence of God, recollect some truth wherein there is substance and food. So you have one of those truths that feeds your soul, right? Pause gently and sweetly thereon, not to employ the reason, but merely to calm and fix the mind. Right? So you're not to think it through, you're to focus the mind on it so it stops running around, right? It stops being so busy. For you must observe that your principal exercise should ever be the presence of God. Your subject, therefore, should rather serve to stay the mind than exercise the understanding. So don't puzzle through something. Get something to focus on that will bring your mind to concentration, and then the attention will actually shift, right? So in the next quote, you can see this transition once you get to the state of meditation. From this procedure, it will necessarily follow that the lively faith in a God immediately present in our inmost soul, see, now we're getting to her understanding of the person, will produce an eager and vehement pressing inwardly into ourselves. So once we sense by faith God intimately and immediately present in our soul, we will just dive in, right? We'll withdraw from everything outside ourselves and go into ourselves. And restraining all our senses from wandering abroad, this serves to extricate us speedily from numberless distractions, to remove us far from external objects, and to bring us nigh unto our God, who is only to be found in our inmost center, which is the Holy of Holies, wherein God dwells. Right? So God dwells in the inmost center of the person, and lively faith apprehends that God immediately, if you will, within us. And that's the focus from now on, is once you discern the presence of God within you, who is love. So once you discern that love within you, you then just dive deeper and deeper toward that center. It's also interesting that, where is it? There's another passage which talks about this. Yeah, God the center. There's a fuller quote that I find really helpful, which I didn't include for the sake of room. She says, when the soul is in its central tendency, I like that. So it's this kind of centering tendency, or in other words, is returned through recollection into itself. From that moment, the central attraction becomes a more potent action, infinitely surpassing in its energy every other species of action. Nothing indeed can equal the swiftness of this tendency to the center. Isn't that a great line? This tendency to the center. And though an action, so it is in fact an action, yet it is so noble, so peaceful, so full of tranquility, so natural and spontaneous, that it appears to the soul as if it did not act at all. Hence the accusation of pietism, right? That your soul is not doing anything, it's being drawn to God, right? This attracting spirit is no other than God himself, who in drawing us causes us to run unto him. How well did the spouse understand this when she said, "Draw me, and we will run after you"? This is in Canticle, the Song of Songs 1:3. And not surprisingly, at the same time she's writing this, she's writing a commentary on the Song of Songs. "Draw me unto thee," she says, "O my divine center, by the secret springs of my existence, and all my powers and senses shall follow the potent magnetism." Right? So there's this magnet at the center of our soul, hoping to draw us to itself. And once we turn to it, or are converted to it, that's another word she'll use, it draws us to itself so automatically that we don't have to do anything. In fact, the more we do, the more we're going to interfere with this movement, right? So it's a tendency. It's like gravity. She says it's actually like dropping a pebble in water. It will just go down through the water to its level that it's seeking. So it's really interesting. She says God has an attractive virtue which draws the soul and more powerfully to himself the nearer it approaches toward him, and in attracting, God purifies and refines it. So there's this confidence that in the center of your soul is not just the presence of God waiting for you, it's the presence of God drawing you. The minute you turn to it, it's going to draw you to itself. All right. So the next phase in this drawing then, and you can see this already, is silence. Right? So when you're attracted to the center, that stills the mind and it draws the heart, right? And it brings you into a position of silence, which is related to other things like quietude and other things like that. So she says, when the divine presence is granted us and we gradually relish silence and repose, this experimental feeling, so notice she's talking about experimental feeling and taste of the presence of God introduces the soul into the second degree of prayer. So silence then becomes the gateway to another degree of prayer. And it's after you've discovered the presence of God by faith in your soul. So she says at the top of page 2, first, as soon as the soul by faith places itself in the presence of God and becomes recollected before God, let it remain thus for a little time in a profound and respectful silence. Right, so don't start yakking, just remain in silence. And then she goes on to talk about that and then says again, I would warmly recommend it to all, never to finish prayer without remaining some little time in respectful silence. Right, so silence, actually she says at one point, she says, the soul feels an unusual serenity gradually being diffused throughout all its faculties, and silence now wholly constitutes its prayer. So its prayer is silence, whilst God communicates an intuitive love, which is the beginning of ineffable blessedness. So this transition from finding the center to silence is an absolutely crucial thing. So this raises you then to another level of prayer. Yeah, Patsy.
And it's this yearning that is also the motivation to not displease God.
Right.
And that's your motivation to reform yourself, because it furnishes the bliss that makes you yearn and go on
No, that's correct.
to higher planes in
My mic
of
just died.
purity.
No, that's right. Let me see if I can get another mic that just died. Otherwise, I have to project. Is it not? Is this on?
Yes.
Yes. It is okay. Good. So yes, that's exactly right. So without this love, you can't please God. And she says your only motive in all of this is to please God. You're not seeking anything from God, right? And so it's this love, this turning to God in love, that transforms your life. And then it's this love which judges you, right? And not, you don't judge yourself anymore. God judges you through this love. So you see yourself more clearly in the light of this love than you ever would on your own. So it's also a way of guiding you to what you would call perfection, because it sees through you in a way that you can't see yourself. So yeah, no, that's really good though, especially about the ethics of it, that it definitely is the center of Christian living then. But notice the center of Christian living is silence, right? And meditation and silence. So you can see she's not one of these people that get out there and change the world. It's like, no, coming into the presence of God who's already present within you, that changes everything, right? That changes everything. But once you get to this level of silence, then other things start to happen as well. What happens is you gradually become stripped away from yourself, right? So the love of God actually takes you away from yourself, takes yourself away from yourself, so that you can be filled with God, right? So there's this kind of replacement that takes place. So the first step of that is found in the second quote on page 2. She says, abandonment, not a popular term these days, abandonment is a matter of the greatest importance in our process. It is the key to the inner court, right? So if you want to really dwell in the presence of God inwardly, you need abandonment, so that whoever knows truly how to abandon himself soon becomes perfect. We must therefore continue steadfast and immovable therein, nor listen to the voice of natural reason. So natural reason would say, are you crazy? You can't abandon yourself, right? Great faith produces great abandonment. We must confide in God, hoping against hope. Abandonment is the casting off of all selfish care, that we may be altogether at divine disposal, right? All Christians are exhorted to this resignation, right? So all Christians are exhorted to abandon themselves to the divine presence and divine disposal. So we're to abandon ourselves to be instruments of God's love, right? So this abandonment, following the silence, then leads to a deeper intensification of the soul's movement into the presence of God in the center, right? This tendency to the center. And that's in this quote right in the middle of the page. And this you can see, this is where the quietism comes in that was being condemned in her thought. Now, when the soul, by its efforts to abandon outward objects and gather itself inward, notice the soul is doing things here. It's abandoning things, right? Is brought into the influence of this central tendency. So you're trying to catch the gravity. Have you ever made a cairn, by the way? A cairn, when you make a cairn, you try to find the point. It's really cool. Actually, my wife's got me totally addicted to this. You find the point where the gravity's traveling through the rock. And it's like a point. It really is a point. And when you find it, the stone will sit in the most unusual positions, right? And so what you're looking for is this tendency of gravity to pull you to the center. And once you find that point, you get into the influence of this central tendency. Without any other exertion, the soul gradually, by the weight of divine love, it falls gradually by the weight of divine love into its proper center. So once you find the tendency, the soul just sinks like a stone into the center. And the more passive and tranquil it remains, and the freer from self-motion and self-exertion, the more rapidly it advances, because the energy of the central attractive virtue is unobstructed and has full liberty for action. So in other words, she's saying you'll move faster if you don't move at all. Isn't that interesting? And this is where she got in trouble, right? Because this was the quietist position. You quiet the powers of the soul, especially the will. But her point is, if you quiet the will, you will do much more through God acting through you than you ever would do on your own, right? So she was really badly misunderstood. Her favorite metaphor for this is sailing. She said, when sailors first start out, especially in her day, you have a pretty good sized ship. When you first start out, you have to row out to where the wind is, right? So you have to get the ship out of harbor. So everyone's rowing. It's really strenuous and a whole lot of exertion. But then what happens? They put the sails up and the wind fills the sails. Do they move faster than they would if they rowed? Oh, God, yeah. All they have to do is have a centerboard and a tiller, right? And a rudder to keep the ship steady. So you want to center your mind and your heart on God. And then the wind blows you much more rapidly, much more effortlessly than you could ever do so by rowing. And so I think that's really interesting, this idea of sailing. So, and it's an amazing feeling when that happens. If you've ever sailed, when the wind hits the sail, it lifts the boat becomes lighter. It picks the boat up and you just plane along on the water. So for her, this tranquility of the soul doesn't mean passivity. It doesn't mean inactivity. It means the soul isn't acting anymore. But it means that what's happening is God is acting through the soul. And I think that's what she meant when she said she was an apostle, right? That God was calling her and was acting through her to teach other people this method of prayer. Well, once you're falling into the center, very strange things happen, though, and they're not usually verbs associated with the love of God in our vocabulary. The first is abandonment, right? So you abandon everything, you abandon yourself to the love of God, and then you find that central tendency, that gravitational thing that pulls you down. But then once that happens, God's love starts to annihilate you. And that's her word. It starts to make you into nothing, right? So that long quote towards the bottom of the second page gets at this. She says, thus doth the soul ascend unto God. I think that's so interesting. You're ascending by descending. Ascend unto God by giving up self to the destroying and annihilating power of divine love. I mean, just think about that for a minute. The power of divine love destroys and annihilates. Kierkegaard will say that. I think he got these ideas from Fenelon. I looked up in his journals to see if he ever quotes Madame Guyon, and he doesn't. But he talks about the same thing. The divine love annihilates you. That's why no one wants to get involved with it, right? So he says, don't ever get involved with God because God will just annihilate you. But and he said, well, once you allow yourself to be annihilated, you'll never want anything more. Right. So this is her idea. Yes, Gabe. And then Glenn.
To me, this speaks to the holiness of God.
Oh, yeah.
That nothing that isn't God can stand in his presence.
Right. Right. No, that's right. So God will annihilate anything.
Christ, which he doesn't already, is a thing that brings us able to stand in his presence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And she would say it's also this annihilation is of all of our little projects and our pet theories and all that stuff. It's just all being stripped away so that, because she says at one point, God is infinite stillness. And in order to enter that stillness, we need to become still ourselves. And one of the ways that we're stilled is all this stripping away, this annihilation of divine love. But it's because love, you're right, love won't stand anything, can't stand its opposite in its presence. So you can't be united to God if we're busy, if we're asserting ourselves, if we're full of ego, right? Yeah, Glenn?
The language just reminded me of the quote from Apuleius that refers to the awful grace of God.
Yeah.
And I remember for a long time struggling over putting awful and grace of God together in the same sentence, but I think it's touching on the same theme as touching on holiness.
Mm-hmm. No, that's right. No, she is in that tradition about the fearsome, awful. Well, she doesn't use that language. It's really interesting. It's because this is love doing this to you. It's Kierkegaard without all the scary stuff. Because for her, it's like, but it's love that's doing it. So don't you want to be annihilated by love? So, but you can see how threatening that would be, right? In the age of Descartes and the age of the Enlightenment, rationalism, and things like that. That no, really abandon yourself to God, let God's love annihilate you, and then God will live in you. But it is a fearsome thing. Her own experience was in her autobiography. She talks about exactly that kind of the awful grace of God. But in the writing, I don't think she wants to scare people away, right? So, although this, destroying and annihilating power of divine love is pretty, that'll get your attention. But yeah, thank you for that. And there are other people, I mentioned when we talked about the binding of Isaac and Luther says of Abraham, if you want to live a cursed life, have God bless you. Right? So there are people who have that kind of plague. Yeah, Lorraine?
Did she wind up in the Bastille?
She wound up in the Bastille, yeah.
From what you're saying, why she was considered a threat, with the king, Louis XIV, the Sun King, who was very much a controlled person. And this is, where's the clergy's role?
Oh.
Where's the ritual?
Where are the sacraments, right?
Where was all of that? I mean, what do you need them for? And you can see why the king, he revoked even not against even limited toleration.
Right.
So this would be very much, his authority is sort of questioned.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
By the church and the king would be very upset with anybody, like this.
oh, yeah, no. And the king had control over the church in France, right? The Pope was the next authority up, but the king had proximate authority even over the bishops. So, yeah, this would be, and the bishops were not, but Fenelon was an archbishop, right? And he supported her. So she had support in high levels, but she also, I think that the scholars who point out her democratizing tendency and also the immediacy that every human being has direct access to God and you don't need anyone to get there. All you need to do is stop paying attention out here and turn inward and discover that what she calls that centering tendency, that central tendency, and you're on your way. So it's very simple. I mean, if you look at her teaching, it is very simple and easy. Right? It's just stop paying attention out there, stop listening to reason, turn in, find that central tendency, and you're on your way. Where are the sacraments? Well, she would say this is ordinary grace of God. So it comes through the sacraments. But for her, don't keep going to the sacrament, right? Because God's already living within you, and you're going to the sacrament looking for God. So we're always looking for, or the clergy, or other things like that, or creeds. She's like, no, it's inside you already. Right. And so all of this is meant to turn you in so you can find it. But then the other question was, where's Jesus? Right. I mean,
the sacraments anyway.
yeah. Okay. We'll forgive you. We'll pray for you. No, that's exactly right. It's the everyone has an immediate access to God. And God dwells intimately and in an unmediated way in everyone. I mean, that's whenever anyone comes up with that idea, clergy, hierarchical religious traditions don't like it. Because what about the priests? What about the sacraments? What about the authority of bishops? All this. But what's interesting is Fenelon became an archbishop during this period and he defended her. And he went to jail also. He was condemned. So it isn't the case that she was all alone and no one defended her, or no one in authority got it. They did get it. And Fenelon agreed with her. It's like, our church desperately needs this, and you're shutting her up. And then he wrote a treatise proving that people from the very beginning of the Christian tradition had been saying nothing other than this, starting with people like Origen, right? Or Gregory of Nyssa, and they had. But the church at the time is like, no, this is heresy. This is really sad. It's a really sad moment that the church got to this point. And you can see the proof of the pudding would be in the eating, the way the Protestants love this. They go, God, that proves this is like heresy for the Catholic Church. So, and they would love it. The Protestants loved it precisely because of the universality of it, precisely because of the unmediated character of it. And so it was the fringe, crazy Pennsylvania Protestants, the Germans in particular, who loved this stuff, and the Quakers, right, who don't have a clerical order as well. So, but it's a paradoxical thing to have somebody really wanting to nourish the church in a way that the church finds deeply threatening, right? But she was in prison for 7 years, I think, including at the Bastille. She was freed, spent well over a decade after that, and recanted. She actually recanted, the things they said were in error, she recanted, but the treatise lived on, right? So we don't know whether she would have stood by the treatise down the line. She probably would have, but publicly she obeyed the church, which I think is significant. But on the other hand, I think McGinn's right. This is just an absolute catastrophe, I think, because her insight isn't unique to her. This isn't a new heresy. And so for it to be called that, I just think is really, really tragic. Yeah, Mel, and then Tim.
Well, this isn't a question. This is a confession. I come to these banquets at the Forum on Sundays, and so it's like I walk out with a plate full of stuff and then feel guilty by the middle of the week. And have my practice.
Hmm.
And I come back for the next banquet. It's just this inner, it's just so good
Hmm.
for hearing, you know, and it's just almost brings me to tears. How much I waste,
Hmm.
how much time, like I should go to a monastery.
Yeah. Yeah.
Eat what's on my plate, kind of, you know, and really take it in, but so it didn't.
No, you're not alone. You're not alone. I mean, this has been really fun to work on her. And when I'm reading her, I'm like, okay, Randall, what have you been doing? Right? You think this is really cool. You know, this is the right method. And I was thinking of, I mean, it's crazy, but I was just doing the Mercy Seminar. We were doing the Upanishads at the beginning of the year. And the Upanishads, this is the same structure in the Upanishads, which she talks about the way you meditate. And God, the Lord of love dwells in the cave of the heart, says one of the Upanishads. I just love that line. And that's her. She discovers the same thing, right? And so then I'm like, what are you doing, Randall? Well, I'm going to watch the Bills and the Bengals. You know, I get really upset about that. So, yeah, no, it's, I think we all, but on the other hand, we have these reminders, right? These voices from the tradition, which is why I love studying the tradition. These voices from the tradition that kind of are splashing us with cold water, saying, pay attention, you know, pay attention to the right things. So no, I really appreciate that. Your candor is I'm in the same boat, right? So why is it only when I'm reading Madame Guyon that I feel this way, but then the rest of the time I'm not doing what she's talking about? And anyway, so thank you for that. Tim, I want to make sure we get.
Question and follow-up. Did George Fox previously in Tennyson? And okay, after that, my follow-up question.
Probably not, because he's in the 1600s, right? So he would be earlier, but the Quakers loved her. The Quakers absolutely loved her. And they would say, because that's Fox's whole point, is that the Spirit of Christ is in every human being. And he goes around, George Fox, you know, the originator of the Friends, they didn't call themselves Quakers, is going around to all the different churches in England at the time trying to learn about Christ. And all of them, and he's reading the Bible at the same time, and they all frustrate him. And finally, he's sitting, I believe, under a tree in desperation, and he hears his voice say, tell the people I've come to teach them myself, and it's Christ in his heart. And that's his message, is Christ is already speaking to you in your heart. The problem is you're listening to all these steeplejack people, you know, who don't know what they're talking about. So yeah, it would be very, her piety is very amenable to Quaker sensibilities. And they, you know, in the what was it, 1804, they translated her into English in Philadelphia. So yeah.
My follow-up question: has the Catholic Church reevaluated or looked at the other quiet?
Well, she was never, you know, it's funny. Fenelon was condemned. A lot of the things in her writings were condemned, which she then submitted to. So no, I don't think they've ever reconsidered the condemnation. I'm not sure. I'll have to check, but I haven't come across that. Which is, to me, again, that was McGinn's point, that this has tremendous consequences for what we've been doing this term, actually, because 1700 basically becomes a place where the tradition really kind of stops. It shows up periodically, but there's no living current of the mystical tradition in the Catholic Church, and Protestants, honestly, are parasitic on that tradition. Right, we are. The Reformation spirituality is pretty thin, right? And so the spiritual sources the Protestantism is fueled on often came from the Catholic Church. And when that stops in the 1700s, it has consequences for all of us, actually. So, which leads to Mel's point. I mean, this isn't something, and this is her point. She's like, I discovered this pretty much on my own. Why isn't the church helping people discover this? I mean, everyone can discover, you don't need a doctor, you don't need anything to discover this. Why isn't anyone helping us live this way, right? Because once you live this way, then God becomes everything. You know, as you become more and more nothing, God becomes more and more everything in you. And it just turns your life inside out, right? Yeah, it's really quite remarkable. The effect that the condemnation of her and her group had. So, hate to end on a bummer, but I hope you enjoy her. She really is something else. So, all right. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.